Zoro is not the first mate of the Straw Hat Pirates, or the vice captain, deputy director, co-chairman, or number 2 in the loo. Zoro is simply Zoro. And this is one of the biggest misconceptions in all of the One Piece. In canon material, Zoro has never, not once, been referred to as the first mate. And that's because Zoro's position in the crew was not intentional. It was the result of a series of pre-production incidents which pushed Eiichiro Oda's preferred vice captain out of the role, had a massive effect on the series as a whole, and completely changed how Oda viewed the structure of piracy. So what we should do first is we should actually define what a first mate is. To the uncultured swine, this might seem like a fairly straightforward discussion because Zoro, he was the first to join Luffy's crew and they're both very good friends, one even might say mates if you were particularly Australian. But the actual meaning of the first mate title has nothing to do with the order in which people join a crew. It signifies the individual with the most responsibility and authority behind the captain, which you may think was Zoro, but that was not the original plan. When Oda was still planning and sketching out One Piece, he had a fairly clear idea of what would eventually come to pass, which can be seen in the earlier known sketches of the Straw Hat crew, which not only includes the OG East Blue 5, but we also see prototypes of Smoking Chopper, Thin Frankie, Cowboy Brook, and a fishman that would evolve into a Jinbei. The only unplanned crew member was Nico Robin. But in addition to their designs, Oda had also quite clearly planned out each crew member's role. And what has always struck me as endlessly fascinating is that the prototype Usopp character was the vice captain and or first mate of the crew, which I think is why Usopp and Luffy have inherited one of the strongest dynamics within the Straw Hats. The two of them, they were instant best friends. So Zoro wasn't actually supposed to have as big of a role on the crew as he does in One Piece, not originally. In fact, I'd say he was probably intended to be around equal weighting with Sanji. And one of the reasons why I say that is because Oda also made a prototype manga called The Great Swordsman, about a rivalry between a samurai and a knight, which is the earliest known appearance of a prototype Sanji named Romeo, who was going to have a bitter rivalry with Ryuma, the character who inspired Zoro. So what changed? What ultimately elevated Zoro to that second-in-command position that we all assume he has? In theory, if Oda wanted to go with his original idea, then he probably would have had Luffy meet Usopp first. And that could very well have been the plan. But what changed is that during the prototype years, Oda briefly had the idea of turning One Piece into a dual protagonist series like The Great Swordsman, focusing on both Luffy and Zoro. The idea being that Oda was a bit nervous that Luffy was too goofy of a main character to carry the series on his shoulders alone. So for a while, Oda was very intent on introducing a more traditionally cool character as soon as possible to balance out Luffy's wackiness and add a bit more broad appeal to the early days of One Piece. Obviously, the dual protagonist idea never quite came to fruition, but that is why Luffy meets Zoro first, because Oda felt that the series needed that contrast as soon as possible. And so Zoro swooped in to take that second-in-command position away from Usopp. And at one stage, he was also going to take it away from Moji because there was also a point where Zoro was going to be a member of the Buggy Pirates in what has been described as an elder brother role. So that's how all of that happened. And what we now have to deal with is the aftermath, which is the accidental placement of Zoro in a role that Oda didn't originally intend for him. And as a result, there isn't a single occasion in One Piece where Zoro is referred to as the first mate or the vice captain. There are certainly a lot of times where Zoro is mistaken by other characters as the captain because he is ever so powersome, but my personal speculation is that Oda has never labeled Zoro as the first mate or vice captain because in the early days he may still have been planning to give Usopp that role. However, as things progressed, Oda stopped seeing a need to define the first mate position. Before I continue, I would be remiss not to mention that there is a piece of official-ish media where Zoro is stated to be the first mate, and that would be the One Piece live action. In episode 5, Luffy's feeling a bit down after the Garp incident, and so Nami, Zoro, and Usopp agree that someone should have a talk with him, with Nami stating to Zoro, "You're his first mate." Kinda seems like that falls under your job description, which is a line that kind of annoys me. Not because they're defining Zoro as the first mate in this universe, that's cool, but because it's not consistent with the previous 4 episodes. Zoro begrudgingly accepts Nami's logic here and goes to have a very brief talk with Luffy, but he shouldn't have, because in the live action at this stage, he still hasn't actually joined the crew yet, let alone taken on a role. After Shellstown, Zoro and Nami were still insisting that they weren't a crew, and Zoro doesn't actually officially join until episode 6, so calling him the first mate here doesn't make any sense. What I think happened here is that the writer for episode 5 assumed that Zoro was going to join the crew after Shellstown, because that's how it happened in the manga. However, the writers of episodes 1 to 4 didn't do that at any stage, because they wanted to keep the whole not a crew gag going instead. And so what you end up with here is a fairly gaping plot hole. But the TLDR is that in the live action, yes, Zoro is the first mate, but it makes no sense. And in the manga, Zoro isn't the first mate, but also kind of is, thanks to a potentially confusing series of pre-production events. And this really hasn't become any clearer over time. These days, whenever the first mate question comes up, people are very quick to point their hand sausages at the color spread of chapter 1031. Very lovely piece of artwork featuring many familiar fan favorites. But hang on a second. Have you noticed the trend with all of these characters? Silver's Ray Lee, Ben Beckman, King Katakuri, and the rest? These are all of the characters who are either labeled as or assumed to be the right-hand men of their respective captains. Although in Katakuri's case, he's less of a first mate and takes on the role of an Asian firstborn, charged with the sacred duty of honoring his mother. Although he's not actually the firstborn child, that would be Charlotte Perospero, and he's busy luring children onto his candy escalator, which is the thing that actually happened. He told the children to, quote, lick his candy escalator. But here, Zoro is smack bang in the middle, and thus confirmed as the first mate / vice captain of the Straw Hats. Done deal. Video over, internet man. Like and subscribe. But there's just one big problem here, which is that Oda then went on to go out of his way to confirm that Zoro isn't the first mate as a result of this color spread. In the SBS of volume 102, a very excitable fictional pirate fan asks the following question. Hello, Adachi. Looking at the cover page of chapter 1031, it seems like Beppo is the number 2 of the Heart Pirates, right? I was surprised, because I thought that Penguin, Shachi, and Beppo were all tied for number 2. Are you saying that Beppo with Sulong is the strongest between them? And to this, Oda replies, that cover, huh? Similar to Zoro, not all of those characters have the title of first mate. I selected the number 2s as I saw fit. Usually Shachi and Penguin are more dependable, but those two who have seen Beppo Sulong form are no match for Beppo in terms of fighting power. I acknowledge him. So if anything, what we have here is a power scaling diagram and not a first mate vice captain diagram. And another interesting point is that Oda posts time lapses of the production process of all of his color spreads, and the idea of drawing all of these number 2s was a bit of an accident. If you look at the time lapse, the original idea was to draw all of the important swordsmen in One Piece, which at one stage included characters like Mihawk and Toshigi, but Oda abandoned that idea and used the leftover Zoro to spawn the eventual color spread. And really, it's just fascinating that Oda not only goes out of his way in series not to define Zoro as the first mate, but actively confirms that he doesn't have this title in extended media. And on top of that, and this is something that we rarely think about, Oda almost never uses the first mate or vice captain titles in One Piece in general. There are shockingly few characters in the series as a whole who have the title of first mate or vice captain. In fact, almost no pirate crews use those titles. I can only give you 8 characters who have been defined as such. And now, to be fair, one of them is Silver's Ray Lee, who was formally introduced as the first mate of the Roger Pirates, and another very prominent figure is Ben Beckman, who was labeled as the first mate of the Red Hair Pirates all the way back in the SBS of Volume 5. But beyond the original concepts of One Piece, the title usage here gets a bit more shaky. During East Blue, we encounter Moji and Django, both of whom were first mates of the Buggy and Black Cat Pirates respectively, and then we don't see a single other first mate again until Jaya, where we meet Big Knife Sarkis, first mate of the Bellamy Pirates, and a character who I don't think anyone even knows exists named Okame, who was given the title of first mate of the Hoka Hoka Pirates in the Grand Blue data file. That's an example of how far I have to dig to find first mates in the series. They are exceedingly rare, and I'll tell you why in a second, but our final canon first mates are Boo, who was said to be the first mate of the Harpo Navy that we met on Dressrosa, and Aladdin, who was the first mate of the Sun Pirates during Jinbei's captaincy, and is now assumedly the captain himself. But that's it. That's all I got for you. Out of over 1,000 characters in 27 years of fictional pirate storytelling, there are only 8 first mates and or vice captains. And I think a big reason for this is that very early on, Oda accidentally broke the pirate mold with his awkward Zoro situation, and it made him realizes that each pirate crew operates differently according to the values of their captain. This can be seen most prominently with the 4 emperors. Whitebeard doesn't have a first mate because the goal of his crew is to have and nurture a family. Whitebeard was a father who loved all of his sons equally, with the responsibility of a first mate being divided over his 16 division commanders. And Marco might be the first division commander, and he did inherit captaincy after Whitebeard's death, but the division numbers themselves do not dictate hierarchy. There's also no functional difference between the 1st division and the 16th division. They were all loved equally by Daddy Whitebeard. For a more dysfunctional family dynamic, you have the Big Mom Pirates, who also follow a non-traditional structure with the Sweet Commander system, which designated vice captain responsibility between 4 individuals. However, it also gets a bit complicated because the Big Mom Pirates follow a family hierarchy as well. We've mentioned him before in this video, but although he wasn't a Sweet Commander, Charlotte Perez Sparrow, the firstborn, held more authority than Katakuri. The Charlotte family were a bit of a big mess. There was no clearly defined second in command. It really was just a system designed to placate their mother as best they could. Then with Kaido, you've got the Beast Pirates who value only strength, but again divide the first mate role across 3 calamities. Blackbeard then has his 10 Titanic captains. Cross Guild has probably the most, how shall we say, unique command structure in modern piracy. Doflamingo had his 4 cardsuit officers, and so on and so forth. The whole idea of having a first mate almost seems like an outdated relic of an idea in One Piece, which is why we only tend to encounter them in the old days of Roger and Silver's Rayleigh. In the modern day, we've evolved beyond that, and that is seen most clearly within the Straw Hats themselves. The Straw Hats are a crew focused on dreams and adventure, and so Luffy doesn't refer to people by their traditional roles aboard a pirate vessel, but instead by their ambitions. And a lot of the time these do cross over. Like Frankie's dream of wanting to build a ship that can sail around the world, it makes sense to call him the shipwright. But there are some where it doesn't make sense, and Zoro is one of them. His dream is to become the world's greatest swordsman. So to Luffy, he doesn't see Zoro as a first mate, he sees Zoro as a swordsman, which is incredibly respectful. He doesn't try to force Zoro into a traditional pirate structure. Instead, he sees Zoro's dream and actively supports it, creating a new role, as he does with each and every other crew member. When it comes to the issue of trust, I often say this with Luffy, but you either have it or you don't. There are no levels of trust. And so there's not really any need to designate a second in command either, because each Straw Hat has their moments where they fulfill that role. And as much as you can definitely say that Zoro often becomes the default second in command, there are so many situations where that role falls to Sanji. In fact, I think if you went through and tallied all the moments where they each take on that position, they'd probably be about equal. But each Straw Hat has at some point taken on that second in command position. And that is why this crew is particularly unbeatable. The Straw Hats are extremely modular and can function perfectly in any configuration, to the point where there's no need for a traditional hierarchy aside from the captain. Because putting people in cleanly defined boxes like first mate or vice captain is the antithesis of freedom. Luffy would never do such a thing, which is why Zoro has never been the first mate and will simply always be the swordsman of the Straw Hat Pirates.